our guest, Andrew Lownie. Andrew was educated at Cambridge University and with postgraduate and doctoral studies at Edinburgh University. He's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, president of the Biographers Club, and a trustee of the Campaign for Freedom of Information. His books include the top 10 Sunday Times bestsellers, The Mountbattens, Their Lives and Loves, Traitor King, The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and most recently, and what we're going to be talking about to begin with this afternoon, entitled The Rise and Fall of the House of York. This is the first joint biography of the former Prince Andrew and his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, described by no less an authority than the Daily Mail as the most devastating royal biography ever written. It's a really fantastic book. It's a meticulously researched account of privilege, power, secrecy and debasement in public life. We're going to be talking about this and we'll take a few questions later on. I thought I'd start with debasement.
Yes, one of my specialities.
Yes. But I mean, when I read your book last year, actually, being a sort of cheap and grubby person, the first thing I did was went to the index and looked up the name Epstein. And I stopped counting at 40 entries. I mean, they're all there: Epstein, Weinstein, Clinton, Trump, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. But I wondered if you could talk about Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and Sarah Ferguson's links with Epstein, and in doing so, just describe to us that wider web of privilege and secrecy that existed at that time. Yeah, I think that's it, because you're very clear that both separately, and this is important as well, separately, both Andrew and Sarah knew Epstein long before they claimed to have done, and much later than they claimed to have done. But in talking about that, can you just describe this web that existed?
Yeah, well, I think one of the revelations of the Epstein leaks in the last few weeks is just how wide these networks stretched, and the tentacles really through leading politicians around the world, members of other royal families. Very easy to penetrate royal families because, of course, there's no oversight into them. But the line has always been that Andrew and Sarah Ferguson knew Epstein really roughly from the late, according to their claims, late 90s till 2010, 2011. In fact, the relationship goes back to the 1980s. I've been interviewing someone recently who's come to me as a result of the book, talking about actually many of the same practices that they were doing, collecting young girls to be taken to Andrew at Kennington Street, way back in the 1980s. Sarah was still staying in Clinton's properties. In fact, she had a flat there, 14G, as late as 2014. I discovered this by a dog walker who used to go by the thing each day and see Sarah coming out. And she got talking to the doorman, and the doorman then began to say, well, she's here twice a month, etc. And I didn't put that in the original version of the book. It'll be in the paperback, because the publishers required two different sources for everything I wrote. Everything is footnoted. And though I had the dog walker, I couldn't find the doorman that she claimed to have met. So we've now got the doorman and we can now do it. But Andrew, again, claimed in that Newsnight interview that he went there in December 2010 to say goodbye over 10 days with a party in his honor and various things, as one tends to do when one says goodbye to people. But now we see that he was still writing to him, offering to, play a bit more much later. And my own feeling is that they were still in touch until Epstein's suicide in August 2019. But you're absolutely right. The network is huge. It's not just a story about financial and sexual misdemeanors. I think it's a story about national security. I was given an intelligence document from American intelligence the other day, dated 15th of January this year, which had basically called Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor political corruption, and was talking about his links with Russian organized gangs through various characters, particularly a man called Rashikev, and how they're linked to Russian intelligence, and how Andrew is well aware that these people who he's involved with have that sort of background. And I was interested the other day that the Spectator's political editor ran a diary from his contacts in Whitehall talking about how this was now a national security scandal. And we've had that story just this week of Beatrice being caught with someone who's accused of spying for the Chinese. And all I would say is the Chinese Secret Service are all over the royal family. There are a lot of people I couldn't write about in the book for various reasons. But they've absolutely been penetrated, both by the Russians and the Chinese, and used that as a way into the wider British establishment.
What was in this for Epstein? Was this purely about connections?
Yes, well, for Epstein, it was about credibility and kudos. He had the respectability of someone like Andrew. Andrew could turn up events, and instead of being a boy from Brooklyn, he could say, "Well, here's the son of the Queen who supports all my ventures." He had clearly pictures of him taken at various royal residences. He was able to show those to people to show how well connected he was. And Andrew, through his links as a trade envoy, had very useful contacts that he could give him. And one of the interesting things is we always think of Epstein providing women to Andrew, but Andrew was actually giving some of his girlfriends to Epstein, and Epstein was then using them. For example, one of them, who's now married to a respectable banker in Hampshire, was trafficked to Trump. And I think there's been a story in the papers this week about a woman who was passed on to Epstein exactly the same way.
Could you expand a little more on Andrew's role as trade envoy, which was quite a long time? It was 10 years, wasn't it? Could you just say a little bit about that role, how that came about, and how he exploited it?
Yeah, when he basically, Andrew got as far as he could go in the Navy. They kept creating jobs for him. He even had the job of Royal Liaison, which no one had ever done before or after. But eventually, in 2001, they had to kick him out. He'd been passed over for promotion as commander 3 times, and he was only got that on what's called the special list, which is a list outside the normal twice-yearly promotions. The Queen he was keen to have what he called a big job. The Queen was keen to basically do this. But Charles actually warned them and said, look, if he does this, he's going to go and play golf, chase women, and make money on the side, which, of course, is exactly what he did. But it was pushed through by Mandelson, then, now an interesting figure in the whole story, Anne Blair and Alistair Campbell. So the poor old Duke of Kent, who'd been doing this quietly since 1976, was pushed out. And I think what they're going to argue with Andrew in terms of misconduct in public office is that he was never a public official. He was a member of the royal family, kind of seconded to this job. But in everyone's definition of public service, I mean, he was basically, we the taxpayer were paying for these trips. He was representing the government. He was reporting to the Foreign Office and the Department of Business and Trade. One of the problems was that it was never very clear who he did report to, and in fact, no one actually wanted him. Normally, what happens is people bid for a royal to come on a visit, and no one was bidding. So he would just kind of turn up, and with Fergie in tow, picking up business cards from everyone she could find. And so that was the problem, that there was no proper focus on him. People were complaining from 2001 when he was appointed, and no one did anything. I wrote to about 3,000 people when I researched this book. Only 300 responded, but most of them, these former ambassadors and heads of UKTI, said they weren't interested in talking to me. Well, I do hope that they're going to be interested in talking on oath to the parliamentary committee, as they should be, because they've been covering up this story. And when you say it's a bigger story, it's not just the story of Epstein's networks, it's the story of how the British establishment have turned a blind eye and covered up Andrew and Sarah's behaviour for years. Of really blatant, shameless profiteering from their royal status, and how they've also perverted the course of justice. The King has said, let the law take its course. Well, if that's the case, I suggest that they begin to investigate the King, because for 15 years the Crown has tried to suppress this story. They've issued denials, they've issued legal threats, they have exerted pressure on news organisations, ABC Television, to their shame, I think, didn't go ahead with a programme with an interview with Virginia Giuffre years before this scandal broke, because they didn't want to lose access to the Prince and Princess of Wales. And one one just wonders how many young girls have been abused in that period afterwards. It's really shameless. The rottenness in the system goes right through the government, the police, who never investigated any of these very pretty clear charges, even though a number of very senior people, including the former head of Royal Security, said they should, and the civil service and politicians. You may have seen a story last week how Andrew was actually putting his massages with happy endings on the taxpayer's bill. And that came to me from a civil servant who was so appalled. He had tried really hard to raise these issues, and as a result, he was the bean counter in the UKTI. He basically got pushed out, and that happened time and time again. Protection officers would complain and told, well, do you want to go back on the beat in Brixton? Ambassadors would complain and find their next posting was to some pretty awful spot in Ethiopia. And that's how they exerted their pressure on everyone. People had to keep quiet. Their pensions were at stake. Andrew was having an affair, for example, with one of its equerries. She's been kindly taken care of by Grace and Favour home at Windsor. And it happens time and time again that people are basically silenced. There's a story I had just the other day from a woman. Andrew was very handsy, and he was being that may not come as a surprise to you. And anyway, a poor young RAF officer, female RAF officer, went to a commanding officer and said, I really don't want to have anything more to do with him. And the commanding officer went and said to the Duke, look, this woman has had enough of your behaviour. Andrew complained to various people. Both of them, the young RAF officer and the commanding officer, actually lost their jobs and their pension rights. And so this is sort of what's going on, and this is what I find so shocking. And we're seeing it in Trump's America, the same thing. People just will stay quiet but not when they see this sort of evil going on, just say nothing.
You mentioned at the beginning that it's the simple lack of oversight that enables so much of this to happen. Just talk a bit more about that. Why such lack of oversight, at the risk of asking an obvious question?
Well, I don't think it is an obvious question. I think people don't realise that we've always been very keen to keep Crown and State separately, since the Civil War, and the idea was that they should be separate. So the royal family, for example, royal wills are sealed. We don't know how many children Prince Philip had because the will is we can't see it, and there was a big case to try and get access to that. But even really minor royals have their wills sealed. They're exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. There's an absolute exemption for the direct line of succession, and then a public interest test for the rest. But from my experience, and I've been doing Freedom of Information since the Act came into play, I've never seen the public interest trumping anything to do with the royals. They have no parliamentary accountability. We had that debate the other day in Parliament, but that was only because of Andrew being an ordinary citizen. You're not allowed to ask questions about the royal family. And there's not a royal register. There was an attempt 20 years ago to set this up. Now, the problem with the royal register, like the parliamentary register, is it's only as good as the honesty of the people filling it in. And again, one of the problems is the royals receive lots of gifts. They will quite often say that the gifts are for them personally rather than because of their position. They won't always declare them. So quite often I've found when I was trying to trace where people had been, I found stuff in the Royal Gifts Register which wasn't in the court circular, but I also found, for example, the court circular was basically not accurate. So people would say, well, Andrew couldn't possibly have been seeing Virginia Giuffre in New York because he was in Boston seeing for Outward Bound. And then when you started talking to people, you'd find that actually the court circular was completely wrong. He had been in New York. So, what I think and other people who feel there needs to be transparency and accountability would like, less opaqueness about their, for example, finances. We know very, very little about the Chancellor of the Duchy of Cornwall, which the Prince of Wales controls, and Duchy of Lancaster, which the King has. They don't have to declare how much tax they pay. They're exempt from inheritance tax and capital gains tax. But these are run as very much commercial operations. There's something called King's Consent, where they can actually influence legislature before it reaches the statute book, and they do. And there's countless examples of them operating behind behind the scenes. We know the stories of Charles and the black spidery letters that The Guardian exposed. But Andrew was doing the same. He was lobbying for all sorts of dodgy people to get passports. And one of the cases, which I found extraordinary, that nothing was done after this, is in 2022, a Turkish millionairess brought a case against a banker at Goldman Sachs called Selman Turk for misappropriating funds that he had given her to invest. And one of the things that emerged from that is that Andrew supposedly been paid £750,000 to help her, where she thought, get a passport. In fact, that had never happened. But also, Sarah Ferguson had been paid £250,000, and the children had also found money in their accounts from people they claimed they didn't know. And it's very obvious this is just money being fenced through the children's accounts. There's a story today in the Mail on Sunday about monies, £50,000 being paid by the Rowlands, who were the sort of backers of Andrew, to the children. So the whole thing absolutely stinks. And you would have thought in 2022, the palace would have had an investigation, the police would have opened an investigation, etc. Absolutely nothing. I've tried for 5 years to get access to the files on Andrew's time as a trade envoy, files which should be in the National Archives. And every which way I ask, they will find an exemption, including health and safety. So, but they use national security, absolute exemption. They'll use the royal exemption. If I ask if it's too widely framed, they'll say they have so much material that it would be too expensive to research it. And the cost is very low. It's 600 quid of people's time. So it's only a few hours' work. Then if you refocus it, they will say they have nothing. And then you go somewhere in the middle, and they'll say this is vexatious because you keep asking the same question. And that goes on and on and on. And so I do hope that they will release stuff, but I really have very little confidence they will do so.
One of the points you make is that, for example, when Andrew was working, in inverted commas, as a trade envoy, but what tends to happen, he's travelling somewhere on the taxpayer's dollar with security and so on and so forth, but there tends to be a couple of days unaccounted for in the diary, except, of course, that the security detail has to be with them, which is one of the sources. You can see the discrepancy. So basically, is he just sort of milking these contacts? He's making the contacts ostensibly on behalf of the government, but then he's just lining his own pocket and the day's off.
Well, he's lining his own pocket on the days on, too. He had what he called private time, so he would go to Thailand or something, and then he would have a week off in some resort, paid for by one of his buddies, or staying with one of his friends. Same in New York, he would go there. He would actually sometimes just turn up, and the consulate wouldn't quite know what to do with him. He would commandeer the consulate car, go off to nightclubs with various girls that he picked up. He would break short. He would say, I don't want to do dinners because I want to go out clubbing afterwards. In South Africa, a program that had taken 6 months to plan, on the day he said, it's quite sunny, I think I'll go and play golf. He would have VIP people that are brought, local dignitaries, to say hello to him, and he'd see a pretty woman across the room and go and shake hands, go and talk to her instead. I mean, he was a disaster, and they all tried to report this stuff. It was reported back to the palace, and basically anyone who did that, including the head of the Foreign Office, was sent away with a flea in their ear. Again, one of the stories, which I didn't put in the book, was about a $5 million bribe he was given in Kazakhstan. And this was reported by MI6 to the Queen's private secretary, who just again sent the MI6 people away saying, there's no point, the Queen nothing will ever be done. So, I do hope that he sorts out his accommodation problems at His Majesty's pleasure, perhaps in Wandsworth rather than Sandringham.
Touched on this already. One of the sort of sobering realizations for me reading your book is there's a sort of I suppose it's media management in a way that, as it were, Andrew is the exception that proves the rule. But actually, of course, they're all, as you've said, they're all at it, really. Yeah,
I mean, they're all leaking against each other. I mean, there are sort of alternative courts, like a sort of Tudor court. And so, to make sure that Camilla is accepted, and I mean, this is all quite well described, they will divert attention and do something on Harry, or you find sometimes when they're looking at the coverage of Andrew that suddenly their stories are leaked about Meghan. And they all have their tame people. So, for example, The Sun was known to be very close to Fergie. They haven't really covered my book at all. Other papers, Vanity Fair and Tatler, for example, again, had interviews with the journalists, and the stories were then killed because they didn't want to affect their relationship with the royal family. And quite a lot of places, I mean, I'm very pleased to be asked today because a lot of people don't want me because the Royal Geographical Society says that, we're royal, and so we can't have you there. People say I'm some sort of closet Marxist. Now, I don't think I look like a closet Marxist, but I do think there should be integrity in public life, and the role of historian and biographer is to tell the truth about the past, and that's what I'm trying to do.
A bit more about sources and people's willingness to talk. I mean, you said sort of roughly 10% of those you approached came back to you, and you hope more will be interviewed under oath in due course. But just how reliable are those sources? I mean, you've mentioned checking everything with 2 different people and so on, but can you tell us a little more about the digging around you had to do?
Yeah, sources, I mean, you're always aware that there may be sort of walk-ins who come in to basically feed you false information to discredit you, and then you lap it up. They give you some cock and bull story, and you bite it. So one's always very careful of sources. And one of my sources, who's turned out to be totally reliable, the publishers didn't trust. He gave me a lot of stuff, for example, about Peter Mandelson, and they didn't believe it. So I hope they now believe it in my source. I went through, for example, the diplomatic list the last 40 years, just basically covering anyone who'd and wrote them, can I talk to you about your dealings with Prince Andrew? Now, sometimes they said, I've never met Prince Andrew in my life. Sometimes they said, oh, yes, I'll tell you about that day that he asked for the massage, or whatever. I went through LinkedIn. That was very useful. All the people who've been at Gordonstoun or I don't know, Dartmouth in certain years. There's a Sun journalist called Phil Dampier who, to his credit, has collected every royal news cutting going back for about 50 years, and I had 6 crates of those, which I then put into a chronology in 6 lever arch files. So if any of you would like to know what Sarah Ferguson was doing on the 3rd of August 1968, I probably could tell you. But then people pass you one person passes you on to someone else. You build trust in people. I find comments at the end of articles or podcasts. People will often say, I've got this story, and then you try and trace them. You're trying to work out what people's names are from their Twitter hashtag. Facebook, places like that, private Facebook pages. I had the benefit of friends who'd gone to Gordonstoun at the same time as Andrew. In fact, one of my best friends was the scholar there, and Andrew was even cheating there. He cheated to get through Staff College, and he was getting my friend to do his homework at the age of 13. So he was the child as father of the man. So, yeah, but it is always difficult. Some of these people also, I had 2 or 3 different versions of Andrew being sacked as trade envoy. So the official version, which I think is right, is Christopher Geit, who was the Queen's private secretary and is one of the few sensible people working in the royal household. Basically insisted that she get rid of Andrew. Andrew and Charles then ganged up against Geit and got him sacked. A lot of the problems of the royal family have stemmed from the time that Geit went. But Lord Marland, conservative sort of said that it had all been done very gently, and Andrew decided to resign. So that's what they do. Again, with Mountbatten, I found material in FBI files showing that he was a paedophile. When I requested further files from the FBI, they said, I'm afraid those files have been destroyed. And when I asked when, they said, after you asked for them. And that happens time and time again. So when I did Traitor King, for example, there are files in the Colonial Office on Andrew's time, the Duke of Windsor's time in the Bahamas, but they're very, very thin. They're what we call being dry cleaned. But what they didn't know was in the Bahamas, there are replicas of all those files, and they had a lot of juicy material.
Brilliant. I'm going to jump in because I know that we want some time for questions.